Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. Today I'm with Donald Barron, Austin Fuller and Dr. Robin Jackson, and we're going to talk about technology, AI, performance and penalties. We discuss the role of technology and AI in performance analysis. We take a look at how international football teams use performance analysis to help them in competition. And finally, we discuss penalty shootouts with a focus on data and deception. Hi everyone, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hi Martin.
Hi Martin, thanks for having us.
No problem, it's great to have you on. What I often do with guests is get them to introduce themselves so they know a little bit more about you. So can you just give us a brief background to your background and your current role? Can we start with you, Austin?
So my name's Austin Fuller. I'm currently product director of our global football and our rugby business at Hudl. But before I joined Hudl, I spent 15 years as a performance analyst across rugby and football, across England rugby at the RFU and also the FA.
Thanks, Austin. And Donald?
Yeah, so I'm the Applied Performance Analysis Strategy Lead at Loughborough. So I've been here 4 years now and I lead our MSc Applied Sport Performance Analysis course. So very focused on the performance analysis pathway for all our students and our partners, and whether they be companies or research partners. But before that, like Austin, obviously worked in professional football for over 10 years as a head of performance analysis, and then worked as a head of technical scouting and recruitment as well. So worked in the Premier League and the Championship, so more club football, but got some practical and academic experience.
Thanks, Donald. And yourself, Robin?
My name's Robin Jackson, a reader in sport and exercise psychology, and I guess my main research interest is around anticipation, deception, and performance under pressure. So penalties could be quite useful. And in a previous life, to some degree, when I was working as a applied practitioner, sports psychologist, also took care of the performance analysis side as well with GB Wheelchair Rugby for a number of years.
Excellent. So it looks like we've got the right people in the room for a great podcast around technology, performance analysis, and we'll get down into the nitty-gritties of penalties later on. To get us started, Donald, can you just give us a quick background on performance analysis, its development and where we are now with it?
Yeah, and I think performance analysis is something that obviously a lot more people are aware of now in terms of maybe visually seeing people on TV. It's been talked about in terms of data and video and how it's used. I think the role itself is very much focused on using objective and subjective information or insights to try and help people make more informed decisions in a real practical sport performance setting, and then also looking at how can we support people improve their performance, develop over time, change behaviours, etc., and ultimately be more successful. So it's some of it's focused on the process of how we get there, but ultimately everyone is judged on results in elite sport at that senior level. And I think the role's developed a lot in the 20 years since I started, essentially, because early on it wasn't really formalised, there wasn't really clear training, and obviously I think a lot of coaches and analysts themselves, including myself, were sort of self-taught and trying to figure out how to utilise technology in the processes. I think now there's a lot more understanding of how to use those insights and actually create the right learning environments, how to share the insights and actually support people and involve them in those decisions. So it's a critical part of support teams, and the roles have grown quite rapidly in the industry. But there's now kind of essentially, research from Denise Martin and her colleagues essentially looked at kind of 5 key areas of expertise, and then a number of areas that performance analysts are applied in to help coaches, sporting directors, heads of recruitment, players, academy coaches, and various different staff members involved in the multidisciplinary team, essentially help them support athletes and reach their full potential and be successful on the pitch or the court or wherever they play.
Interesting, you mentioned multidisciplinary teams there, and I've spoken to another and it's usually the psychologist would talk about interdisciplinary teams and all those people working together and all those departments working together. Is that the sense that we have nowadays? Because performance analysis can step into coaching, it can step into physio, strength and conditioning, team selection. It seems like there's an important role there if everybody's bought into it. Is that what you're finding nowadays? Or is there still this, I'm the coach, I know best? Or where are we with that?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of progress on that. And I think there's been, a lot of education from a lot of different stakeholders, whether it's national associations, or whether it's universities, or whether it's just people being really proactive and having a growth mindset. I think that there's much better awareness of how everyone can work together, and there's probably more sort of transformational collaborative leadership styles that are present now. Some of the hierarchies are breaking down. They're still there to some extent. And I think a lot of teams do want to work in a more interdisciplinary way where they're all collaborating, but some people are still on that journey. They're still trying to either physically work out logistics of how do they get people to interact and see the overlap between each other's areas. And sometimes it's just the size and scale of their teams that certain individuals will interact with the wider teams more often than others. But yeah, I think it's there's a lot more positive interactions now and interactive discussions rather than sort of dictating what is used and what isn't, or how it's used. And I think it's more positive as well. Previously, I've sat in a lot of meetings where information is used to either be a carrot or a stick, and now I think it's more of like a learning environment. Even at the senior levels, I think there's a lot more individual player development plans and looking at principles of play, etc. So it's more of a learning process rather than just a carrot and a stick.
From being around the edges of this, it certainly seems like people are bought in a lot more to it, and especially players. Players seem to want to know this, they want to see this. Therefore, coaches are in, everybody's in, and it seems much better. And again, going back 20 years, they were probably just starting to bring videos in, but not necessarily knowing what to do with them. Where are we now? So Austin, you're working at Hudl, and so looking at the technology side, where have we advanced to now with technology? What technology are we using, and then how may we be starting to use AI to assist in this field?
Yeah, I think going on back on Donald's point quickly before we go to the technology side, I think if you took performance analysis and you were around it 10 years ago, everyone would say it'd be supporting the coach to make better decisions. Whereas actually the coach has realised that it needs to get decisions from multiple different factors. And I think this is where you see the boom in data and video and information you're gathering from different departments, which actually is widening the role of a performance analyst, because they're meant to be the data specialist or they're meant to be the person. But I think there's a factor around what performance analysis is and the impact of data science and coaching technologies and all everything we have there, which is broadening the options that people have within the industry, because we're seeing a boom in a lot of different areas that have an effect on performance analysts. But where technology and data can really power this is the efficiency part. So I always talk a lot across Hudl and across the industry around two clear areas. It's the evidence to help you make decisions. So there's that subjective information, if that's video, if that's things like penalties we talk about later, about how many penalties scored in certain zones. That's all information to help you make a better decision. But in an area of performance analysis where technology is really strong, and it should be strong, it's making it efficient for you to save time. Because time is a real commodity in the world of performance. When you've got really little time between matches or you've got time to prepare, you've got to be able to use technology efficiently to save you time and still answer those questions. So I always look at it in those two buckets when we're looking at how we develop technology or how the customers that we serve are actually using that. And I think those are two fundamental things that we should really think about if you're going into this industry or you're in the industry, is really take those two things as like, are we impacting them? So I'll give you a real life example. People might manually tag events within a process that we have. Say in Hudl, we have our technology and sports code. But also, how can we automate that by using some of the event and tracking data available in the world of football? So using that to automate it gives you more time to then actually be able to steer better evidence or more subjective information. And that's one thing that we see in industry at the moment is 90% of the time is spent finding that evidence and that information that's going to try and impact you. But how much time do you actually spend on the efficiency to get you to that answer quicker? And that is a fundamental piece that I stress a lot in the industry today.
So when you talk about that information, what type of information are we now automating for those who don't really know performance analysis or the detail? And can we give some background on the information that is being used? And then let's have a look at how international teams, so we've got the Euros, how are they using some of this data to improve their performance?
Yeah, I'll go back to when I first started my journey in performance analysis. It was very different to what it is today now. And that's over a 15-year span, where you've got the ability to write down a piece of paper, and you'll see coaches do this now. This is still performance analysis when you're writing notes and information and collecting it in a different level. But now you have the companies of the world and also other offerings where you can get event data, which is your shots and your passes and your tackles and your duels and all the information you want from the events that's describing what's happening on the field. But you also have your like, so the tracking data, which teams will be using in the tournament today, which then can look at things like locations of players, both sides of the ball, or you can have a look at the physical demand on that, sprint speeds and all of that information you have. So you're galvanizing a lot of information on a lot of players, but it fundamentally comes back to what you want to achieve, and are you achieving what you're trying to do? And you'll hear this mentality of a game model or playing philosophy or how you want to actually implement a tactic within the game. But it's making sure you're using that information you've got to actually impact what you're trying to do or what you're trying to affect, because that's something that we see in industry. You have all this information, but if you don't use it effectively, it's not really going to provide you the information you want to make a decision in game, in moment, or pre or post, depending on your workflows you're using.
So what kind of things are we specifically talking about? And kind of any of you can jump in here around how does that conversation go with the coach, and where does this conversation start? So let's just give a bit of an example. You're in the Euros, okay? What's the analyst doing pre-tournament? Are they analysing every single team that's going on and looking at the opposition? And what are they picking up on there? So are they picking up on, all right, if you're the right midfield player going against that fullback, go to the left of him, go to the right of him. Are we talking about that? Are we talking about different tactics that we should be using specifically? So, for example, the guy last night, I would never have crossed the ball anywhere near the centre half last night because there was nobody in the world would beat him in a header. So where are we going with that kind of thing? Or is it later than that with a tournament? Is it like, okay, right, England have got Switzerland coming up. Right, let's have a look at how they play. Or is this all pre-done? And then how is that communicated to the players and taken into training to actually implement something? Massive question there. So if any of you want to jump in whenever you need to, then let's go.
I could take a bit of this and then I'll let others talk. I think it starts with a preparation of how you actually want to go and play. And there's a couple of things how you do that. And we talked about what it takes to win at the start where you mentioned it. It's actually what does it take to go and win a Euros, win a World Cup. But you've also then got to take into consideration the people and the players you have to fit the systems that's going to go and impact the winning that you have. And there's lots and lots of science that goes behind that of what it takes to win and the game model. But once you've got a game model, the next principle is in the opposition analysis framework is what's your game plan from the game model you have to go and beat that opposition. And I think that's where you'll see these tactics might change or formations change or positions. But there'll be a fundamental game model. And that's when performance analysis really kicks in of like, what's it going to take to win if we play in this game model against these opposition? And that's where performance analysis is like really key in the moment. So I think those are like the fundamentals that you'll see in the Euros with teams. You'll see Spain, you'll see England. They play in a very structured game model that they've worked on for months leading up into these tournaments.
Donald, did you want to jump in there as well?
Yeah, I think that the longer piece, like Austin was talking about, is it's going to come over a longer period of time, and it's going to naturally progress. Obviously, people are going to start, if there's a new manager or new structure, they're always going to start to do a general review of what has gone before, but what would we like to implement, but what lessons can we learn from the broader game as a whole, over a longer period, and then look at, like you said, individually break it down. Context is really important, everything. So what kind of players do we have available? What kind of way has that coach previously played? Like, what do they think might be the best approach for them? And how can they go and implement that? So then, depending on the size and scale of their team, so England and Germany and these larger, more developed countries, their investment is massive in international football. So they'll have a broad team that have different specialist skills. So some people will work very closely with the coaches themselves, and they might hear the term like coach analyst or just post-match or opposition analyst, all the way to another end of the spectrum are more medium to long term, where they have data science skills and working with much bigger data. And they'll have different remits, but some of those staff will generally be looking around at the trends of tournaments and sports and the teams that they're potentially going to play against. But they'll also be tracking the potential pool of players that they could pick from. So who are the players out there that they know? How are they performing and changing over time? So like Harry Maguire, England will know him in huge detail, but how is his performance changing? And technology now, the tracking data and the resources available can tell you physically and technically and tactically how are they performing in different phases of play, in different aspects of their performance. Are there any improvements, decreases, any areas of concern? And natural availability is a huge question that has hung over the England team and other teams as well. I'm a Scotland fan where a number of players got injured leading into the tournament. It has a huge impact on, well, then what does your squad look like going from that? You know, how can you adapt, or who could replicate that player's qualities, or how do you maybe have to adapt to play with a different sort of individual in your team? So obviously Scotland and Lyndon Dykes, a player who unfortunately injured. Can you replicate that? Is there another player that's similar? There wasn't. So it's then how might they need to adapt? And it's the same for England. They've had injuries in that left back or left wing back role. What can you do? What are your potential opportunities? But it's then, as they start looking at teams, it's forward planning of who are all the potential opponents, how do they play, what how do they play in each phase of play, set pieces, strengths and weaknesses, different things they might come up against, and trying to have some pre-planning so that when you've only got 24, 48, 78 hours, 72 hours or so to prepare for a game, you're not trying to go back through massive reams of video or data to try and think of how are you going to make your team selection, what kind of matchups are there, what kind of units or patterns of play do they need to work on the pitch? Because ultimately they only have so much training time. So you're trying to pre-do a lot of that work and have multiple teams working on each opponent you might come up against, and it's almost like pre-plan your content. So then it's, people who are former coaches, scouts, analysts working together to analyse these opponents and almost have that content ready as soon as you know who you're playing next, if you get to the knockouts, etc. So there's a lot of content that goes from that, longer term picture all the way up to the 2 or 3 days before a match takes place. And that's to try and help a coach make really difficult decisions. But ultimately, people are the core of that, and they need to think about, their understanding of the mentality and the fitness of the players and how the matchups might work. But they're trying to make informed decisions. So they'll have all the resources available in a condensed format that they can engage with, and then they'll have to actually make a decision. But they've got the correct information, good insights, rather than making a judgment purely on their own gut or instinct.
I'm just going to throw in there some of the things that you'd probably hear from the terracers and potentially from over the last 20 years. So how much do coaches focus on the team they have compared to the team they're playing against, and how much should they have? Here's our plan, and this is what we do. So there'd be the old saying, focus on yourself. You can't control the opposition, but you can control what you do. How much is that one of the focuses? I'll start with that one.
I think people sometimes overemphasize the work that's done on opponents. I think every team, whether it's club or international football, is preparing for the team they're going to play against. Players and coaches are all individuals and maybe emphasize certain things slightly more or less, but they all want to know what they're going to come up against. And athletes don't want surprises on a match day. They want some information on who they're playing against or what's expected of them in their role. And I think what really good teams do now is just get the right balance between those two things so that they're having good team meetings and work on the pitch. And some coaches will emphasize doing the preparation and observing the opponents and then practice it on the pitch, or some will do a combination of those actual team meetings or discussions and the pitch work, and it's just a balance of the two, but they're all carrying out that work, and the devil is in the detail to some extent of the quality of that preparation. And then what they're trying to do is decide how can you be more effective in implementing your strategy, and are there any areas where you want to try and limit a certain individual's influence or a certain combination or unit's influence on the game. So I think coaches now, what they're trying to use the technology and the information for is almost create a picture of the game they want that would suit their team the best. So how would this game play out to help us be more successful and have our best players be able to influence the game? And then vice versa, try and limit. So if someone like England comes up against Mbappe or a special individual like that, or players are playing against Bellingham or etc. For England, how can they restrict their influence on it? And obviously for their own team, how can we try and feed them the ball in the areas they want to have an influence? So it's just a balance of the two. And I think that a huge thing comes in, it's same in combat sports, etc., is essentially who's probably the more dominant team. And I think if you're a less dominant team, sometimes you have to be a little bit more defensive and counteract the opponents more than try and implement your own game plan.
You mentioned combat sports there, and I won't remember who said this, but there was somebody who said, everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face. Okay,
Mike
so
Tyson. Yeah.
Was it Mike Tyson? Is that what yeah. So, I mean, take that analogy into football. So you've got this plan and you're going, this is how we're going to play. But again, this is the bit where trying to get a depth of understanding. The opposition obviously know how we play and they're trying to counteract us. We're trying to counteract them. Okay. How much analysis is going on in game for decisions to be made, and how much preparation is being done for changes that are going to occur? Because, if somebody's analysing England, they're saying, oh, look, England are likely to do this. We know they know what we do. So if we know they can counteract it, have we then got plans to counteract that? Like how much depth is this going into, ready to go, right, guys, we've got to switch to this, give this a go. What do you know, like if we start looking at basketball or a lot of the American sports, they're almost scripted, for want of a better word. How far have we gone with that within football? Does that question make sense? Does it?
I can answer a little bit. I think it's really important with international sport in general, especially a team environment. You've got to be really clear on what you want to do, because you've only got the players for a short period of time that don't play with each other regularly. So it's really important to stress the fact of like, what we do is fixed. If you're providing too much information, you're ripping up the book every single time, you're going to cause confusion and no clarity and no understanding of what you're trying to achieve. So I think in international football, you've got to be very careful about that you don't overstep that. And there's only a certain amount of people that can deal with lots of information, as we all know. Not everyone can deal with lots, but if you think about it, you've got 7 or 8 opportunities, maybe the game before the lead up to tournament and then the other games you've got, to really prepare for what you want to do. And you've got a short window because you've got Champions League finals or Premiership games or all of this stuff that comes into it. So you've got to have that clarity. And then what you do, once you've got that clarity, you can adapt a little bit more. So you can actually start planning the adaptation of positional changes or formations, or actually adapt into the opposition you're facing. And I think it's really important as well to focus on not just on the opposition, but how that opposition is going to beat you. What's your strengths and where those meeting together, rather than just isolating opposition in isolation. So I think that's really important, because if we can stay in the way that we are and we can beat the opposition with what we found, I think then that gives you the clarity to go and know what you've got to go and do, and you can tinker a little bit. And then it becomes of like planning substitutions and all of that. In football, it's probably a little bit more fluid than it is in other sports like rugby, for example, where it's probably more fatigue because of the physical nature of the game, and you can see a pattern of players being taken off at certain times. Whereas in football, I think it's a little bit more off the cuff. You'll have your regulars that you'll see coming on a regular basis. So if you look at Portugal, they have regular players that come on at certain positions. But then you've also got to think about, if it unstables the team, is it going to have a bigger impact on like other people questioning whether it's the right formation or whether you're going to do it? And you can see it in the press at the moment around, is it the right thing? Well, if you look at history, you can tell that not all the teams that go and win the tournament actually do successful in the first group stages and go on and don't do so well in the latter stages, because it's that cohesion part as well. And it's going back to that clarity of what they're trying to achieve. I think that's something that we kind of take for advantage, just think it's a club game and we're applying it to international sport. It's very different.
So just, one of the big developments when I was doing this way back in the day when Sports Code was version 1 or something 20 years ago, it's all about analysing the game afterwards, your opponents and your upcoming opponents and designing your strategy around that. And I think one of the biggest changes we see now is the sort of pitch side type analysis that's going on. So to what extent is that used to influence in-game decision making? Is that, I guess the question would be, what is it? Is it purely physical type data? I think England Rugby were using things to decide when somebody had run their race, if you like, and needed substituting. But what sort of other things are being used there to influence decision making in the moment?
I think the biggest progression, so naturally with a lot of processes, you go from that manual collection all the way trying to automate it so it's generated quickly. But you go from whether it's pre or post game, and it takes a long period to actually being available instantaneously. So now you'll see on the bench, everyone's got an iPad or a small sort of tablet of some sort. They're able to look at that live in the moment, and the teams I mean, things like automatic or semi-automatic offsides are based off multiple cameras, around 10 cameras. These teams have got access to, depending on the competition, sort of between 10 and 16 camera angles. So they've got that video aspect that's live, and they'll have multiple people reviewing that and trying to identify key areas or key parts of the game plan they worked on beforehand and identify how they're going well. But in terms of the data, they'll be getting feedback, whether it's from a wearable device or tracking data. They can get that live in-game, so they can get that physical feedback on what are the demands of the game, what is each individual doing, how they're responding to it. And that might give some cues to certain people hitting thresholds, either just because of the amount of work they've put in the game, if they've got a real high pressing strategy, if it's a really high tempo game, the ball's in play a lot, there's not been many natural breaks. That can start to give them an indication, when they might think people are fatiguing and then naturally want to make changes. Or there's all the technical tactical data coming in as well from different providers that can help them understand how are people influencing the game. So our perception of the game isn't always the same as what the data is telling us. So sometimes, naturally, because it's so fluid and there's so many players and tactical elements, and coaches are at pitch level, they can't always see the bigger picture, or they can't always see each individual unit and how it's interacting. So that's where, rugby has progressed to, they want that almost like eagle eye view, but they have access to that wide angle view on the bench now, and they'll have staff who've got that view as well. But they will be communicating via the bench and other staff, and they can even be working remotely in another country, in a base at a training ground or facility, accessing all that content and feeding back information as well. So there's a lot of layers behind what's going on the pitch, but ultimately the head coach, the manager, the coaching staff are the ones trying to make those decisions. So what's fed back needs to be filtered, and someone needs to try and condense that and pass on key messages. And it's the same from a medical perspective, that there's a lot of focus on concussions and other aspects as well, to check that player safety and other aspects are being monitored as well. So it's not just a football side, there is the health side and the medical side as well, which I'm not as knowledgeable about, obviously, but it's a part of how that technology has been used live in game.
Can I just bring that down to kind of a practical level? And so you've talked about simplifying this massive data that we have. So if we look at it from that physical perspective, what is it that we're using to, if we do use that for substitutions? You mentioned it in rugby. Are we using heart rates? Are we using high velocity sprints and kind of volume? And do we know those individual capacities that we think, where the max performance from this player is X, or is it also potential for injury? Are there simple metrics that are now trying to be used, or is that still in the infancy to go, well, we know these are important, but we don't quite know how to make decisions, or is it in between on that, or just on that physical side to start with?
I think what you're trying to, it's a big question, and we could break down for hours talking about this, but I think the important thing is I'll go back to it because I stress it, your game model of how you want to play the game, and making sure that your players are physically robust to go and do that. So if it's things like load, or if it's things like sprint capacity, or if it's total distance they want to run, whatever it is, the metrics can be as long as you are to what you're doing. But if it's more of that back to the tactical ability, so if you look at a Man City, they're going to have repeatable sprinting up and down the thing for the fullbacks. And you see this in modern football. Whereas if you look at, say, a striker, it might be a little bit different. So it'd be different metrics for different positions. And I think that's the thing to really stress. It doesn't fit everybody, and it depends on the tactics of the game you want to play. So if you look at, say, a Man City versus a team that maybe play a little bit more defensively, they're going to have very different trends and benchmarks of what they can hit from a threshold perspective. So again, it's going back to the threshold of each one of the metrics that you're going to hit to have an impact on what you're trying to achieve. And there's lots of metrics you can have a look at. So counterattacks is a really interesting one. So if you look at counterattacks and the speed of the counterattack, and whether if you're playing a counterattacking game, can players continuously do that over a course of 90 minutes? Or even you going into extra time, can they carry on do that? Because counterattacks is a big place in the world of extra time. So I think all of those factors are really important to think about, going back to what you're trying to achieve from the tactics of what your coach or what your team are actually going to want to do on the pitch.
They are very individualized, and they're very, very team specific or unit specific, where different players have got very different thresholds, and what the the sports scientists, the sport performance and medical staff will be doing is learning more and more about their players and what their individualized thresholds are, and they'll start to get a feeling for when they're not able to then repeat that sprint ability or high intensity. And some of that coaches and others will just visually see, and other aspects there will be data coming back of, is my eye and the data matching up? So are they still able to hit that high end of their sprinting ability? Are they still able to press with intensity? But in terms of other aspects, you can now sort of preload your analysis software to give you markers and flags of how many times certain things are happening, like penetrative passing in certain areas and certain tactical things you've worked on. And what they can do is start to indicate when they're going towards a threshold that indicates, look, their XG is rising, like they're creating more pressure, these instances. Tactically, you'll be able to see exactly the position and what is the reason for that happening, but you can start to see in the data, same with set pieces, etc. What kind of patterns and movements are players making, and where are we losing markers, or what are the threats that we need to stop? But they can actually review these instances back as well from multiple angles and just double check the information they're passing on and giving to the other coaches or players is accurate. So what exactly is the issue they need to correct, or what exactly are we doing well that we want to see more of? Can we influence the game more, or go back to something that we've maybe kind of drifted from? So they use that video and data to kind of monitor and flag certain things or trends that are going in the right direction or are negatively impacting the performance, but really breaking down exactly why is it happening so that they give accurate feedback onto the pitch. It's very difficult to do it in game. They can potentially do it, but it might usually be something that's for halftime. We're preparing our reset and kind of refocus to go again, or make decisions on how we're going to change the game in the second half.
So massive question. It's kind of last question, and we'll move on to kind of penalties, because we've got a lot to cover in that as well. So if we are truly like interdisciplinary, and this is an open question, like where are we with this now? So if we do have individualized knowledge, and again, can we have that at international level? How much sharing's going on with clubs? Is that needed? It's probably a wider question. But if we could have individual physical traits where we know the performance of this player physically, is it at a stage now we also know that, if fatigue starts to set in, do we know technically what's going on there? So, your fatigue ratings, wherever it's at, whatever metrics you're using, we know that if it drops below this level, their passing starts to go, or their shooting starts to go. And then the other side of that is tactically, if we've set up for this player to play in this position, but actually they're not, they're doing something differently, like how quickly are we picking up on that information? And then how easily is that shared with managers? So I know, and I don't know if this is still the case. So I know 10 years ago, I went to Man City, and the analyst room, as you walk in, there's a little room at the side for the analyst, and a conversation went on, and then they could put it on the big screen. Is that stuff happening, or is it more, do you know what? Yeah, the data's there, but no, this is subjective. We're in the moment. We know what's going on, because so many people would have subbed Bellingham and Kane in that game the other night, and then they produced the goals to win us the game. So huge question there. How much is this holistically coming together, and how much is it impacting on in-game decisions, or is it more pre-post?
I think that's the difficult part, is from using the data to suggest what's happening to then what the player and the coach is feeling on the game. That's always been the hardest question to ask, because it could be keeping a player on is for leadership, to actually lead the team, make sure they're driving the standard and really taking them to the next level, but they are fatigued and they're not performing at the highest level, but you take them off and then that goes. So like there's lots of nuances within that from a psychological perspective, or from the actual team environment, or just a message to the team of like, he's coming off. Oh, this is quite scary. He doesn't normally come off. Like all of that is quite impactful. So I think that's the hardest thing. I think there's lots of technology out there. We have a product called Insight, which takes the event and tracking data and it notifies you and automates some of those events, and then people can see them on an iPad or even their laptops that they might have on the bench that you see today. And then how that message is communicated to the coach, when there's lots of messages. You've probably got sports science, you've probably got psychology, you've probably got three other coaches. You've got lots of people. So I think the key thing is like, how do you communicate the information to make a decision fast? And that's a real tough thing to get right. And like Donald said, in football now, more and more people are using radio communication. You might have 10 analysts back at your training base feeding information, because technology allows you to be more efficient in that way. So you don't have to have lots of people in the environment. But you'll naturally also see an analyst maybe up in the stadium like you do in rugby. So you might see him higher in a vantage point, so you can actually see a wider grasp of the game to make sure nothing's being missed. But for me, like, it's the information you're providing down to the bench. And this is why I went back to my point at the start. Technology makes that easier to do that. Without technology, it's a lot harder to make those decisions. So using that technology to be really efficient, and then using the data effectively to actually make that decision. And I think those two are really important to really go back to as my main point when it comes to making decisions quick.
Again, thinking back to this old school stuff, but one of the huge advantages of the performance analysis was to cut through the bias that you might have, whether that's from a player perspective or a coach perspective. So we used it quite a lot actually in post-game debriefs, where it had previously been just a big group of different opinions and individual biased opinions as to what happened on the court, and then we could go straight to the actual, clips of the different things which cut right through that. So I think that's for me is probably the biggest benefit, I suppose, or potential benefit of performance analysis, is getting that, taking the subjectivity away from it, albeit you still have to interpret and cut through what's the most appropriate data, and to be confident that those data are predictive of the things you want them to predict. And I think we're gathering data on so many things now that that's maybe where AI can come in and maybe answer some more complex questions and say, well, actually, it's not the simple things that we can comprehend and test. It's actually a whole range of complex things coming together that are predicting the things we're interested in.
Robin, that's perfect timing, really, to bring me in, because we've talked about kind of technology and the wider piece around data and semi-automated and AI type pieces. But I want to have a little focus now on penalties, because obviously we're at the Euros and the quarterfinals are coming up, and we had a lovely penalty shootout to watch last night. So we've got plenty of information to talk about. Can you just start us off with talking about penalties and the research that you've done around things? So whether that's around perceptions or attention or deception, just start us off somewhere with penalties, and we'll go from there around what data is available now and how we kind of counter that. So over to you, Robin.
Yeah, I mean, my main interest on this and a whole range of sports where deception or deceptive actions come in, those sort of one-on-one kind of events, is how you can read an opponent and how you can fool an opponent. And how things like your knowledge of their preferences influences those sorts of things. So we start with all those things in terms of the time constraints of the given situation. So, won't bore you with too much data, but, penalty kicks of 25 years ago were taking about 600 milliseconds from kicking the ball to crossing the line. Now it's closer to 400 milliseconds. So that's significantly decreased the amount of time the goalkeeper has to react and dive across. And in fact, it means that they have to try and either read the opponent or make a or a decision before the player has kicked the ball. So that's where perceptual skills, your ability to read subtle differences in, say, the run up of the player or how they shape towards the ball might benefit a goalkeeper. And yeah, I've done some research around, EPL, a couple of seasons of EPL penalty kicks back in the day, some perceptual training studies on trying to train people up to get attuned to the various information sources. It's also interesting from a pure psychological perspective as well, obviously the pressure side of it. So that's the other area of research that I've done. So essentially, if you pick a task that represents all the stuff I'm interested in research wise, a penalty kick's about it, really.
Well, let's go into some depth of penalty kicks and some of the practicalities at the moment. So we're all aware now that the goalkeeper either knows all the last 5-10 penalties that you've taken, or the analyst has done that and they've said, look, he's going to kick it this way. But the penalty taker knows that and the goalkeeper knows that, and they both know what's going on. Is that cancelling each other out, and then it brings it back to the things you're talking about cues and things? Or where do we think we are with that at the moment? Yeah,
I mean, the biggest change with the increase in kick speeds or more forceful kicks has meant that if goalkeepers are going to try and read what the player does, it has to be really up to about half a second before they kick the ball, which sounds like a very brief period of time. Actually, it's a full stride out. It's when your kicking foot kind of lands prior to actually kicking the ball. So So you're trying to read what the player's doing incredibly early, and that's very, very difficult. There's very little information. If you look at studies of kinematics of what players or good players are doing, there's very little to pick up that early in the run-up. Obvious things like the run-up angle, or whether the player looks to where they're going to kick the ball, there's those sorts of things. I guess traffic light type signals, Boris Becker, I think his tongue used to point to where he was going to serve to, and Agassi picked that up, told him after he retired. So, so there's those sorts of things. But it's exceptionally difficult. I think, prior to, I spoke to the insights team at England prior to, I think it was 2018 World Cup actually. They were looking at goalkeeper dive preferences as well as player kick preferences. So there's a range of those sorts of stats available, and then they can decide to use them or not. I think Jordan Pickford at the end of the tournament, or after we'd won one of the shootouts there, said that 4 out of 5 of their players went their way, I think was the term he used, suggesting that they knew that there was maybe a 60-40 preference to go to one side or the other, and he bet on the 60%. So that's a strategy you can use. But I think as players, as kickers become increasingly aware of all these data, then obviously they adapt accordingly, so that they're unlikely to have a strong preference to kick to one side rather than the other. Looking at the EPL data from a couple of seasons, it seems that players were or are trying to shape to one side and then kick to the other. So they're trying to influence the keeper to some extent. And that was somewhat successful. Keepers diving to the wrong side a bit more often, particularly if you shape to relatively close and then open up and kick to the right side for a right-footed kicker. Then that seemed to be pretty successful. So there's some of that going on certainly, but overall it's in the favour of the kicker. Overall it's made the goalkeeper's task even more difficult. And possibly for that reason, they're perhaps paying a little bit less attention to the kinematics of the kicker.
I think to kind of give a practical aspect to the story there, it was interesting with Ronaldo's penalties, and we're recording this the night after, and Ronaldo missed that first one, and he's gone to the keeper's left, but the keeper, I've looked at this just before, he definitely dived before he hit it. And he's got down into the bottom corner and he saved it. Ronaldo then changed what he did, and he walked up a little bit. He stuttered a little bit. Yeah. And I think by the time he's got to that last step, the keeper hasn't moved. And therefore, and this is me trying to explain what you said there, therefore he's then just smashed it as hard as he can with kind of one step into that bottom corner. So would that therefore probably be impossible for the keeper to save? I think Bruno Fernandes did very similar and often does that stuttered run up and then a lot of speed in that last kind of piece of it, so the keeper can't dive and can't react. Is that what they're doing there?
Yeah, they're two slightly different strategies. So Ronaldo did the little stutter, and then he just takes a quick run up over the last step or so, maybe 2 strides, but it's quick. Fernandes definitely tries to, and Jorginho, tries to trigger a dive in the goalkeeper to go early. That's essentially what, so they have an unfluent run up, have the little stutter or the sort of glide through the air before landing, to try and get the goalkeeper to move early, and then they've got enough time to see that, notice it, react, and go the other way. That's the plan for the goalkeeper dependent strategy. Goalkeeper independent, you basically either predetermined, or as Ronaldo maybe does something in his run up to try and suggest something's going to happen, but then is going to kick to a target with pace. 2 different strategies. In terms of the goalkeeper dives, they always have to dive before the ball is struck to have a chance of getting there, about 200 to 300 milliseconds before the ball is struck. Hence how how early the information has to be if they're going to use it. In fact, I think I did have a quick look at the dive times for those 2, pretty similar, in fact. So once Ronaldo finished his little stutter steps and then did his sort of final stride, and the goalkeeper was pretty much initiated their dive. And he had to be very accurate with that kick to be successful. The keeper went about as early as you'd predict he should go to cover as large an area as he possibly can without giving away which direction he's diving. But it was a very good penalty with Ronaldo's second one. Slightly less accurate his first one, slightly more in a savable position. But yeah. So yeah, there's multiple things in play there, you know, that in terms of the strategies the keeper uses, but also the strategy that the kicker uses. From a psychological perspective, you want to be very clear about what your strategy is before a shootout, certainly.
I've got a couple of practical questions, because I'm sure I remember from my undergrad that Peter Shilton in 1990 went the right way for every penalty, but saved none of them because he reacted as they kicked the ball. So he was just too late. He was never going to save any of them. Is that?
Yeah, and he did that deliberately because he had noticed that I think roughly at least one kick out of the 5 was down the middle. So I think it was in his autobiography or something, he's saying that he was waiting for effectively waiting for the kick down the middle, and clearly then if they don't go down the middle, you have to respond to ball flight. And whether he knew at the time or not, he discovered the time constraints involved even back then, which were if you do that, even where you go the right way, the ball's in the back of the net before you can reach it.
Okay, so let's look at some practical kind of strategies that people could do. So it's all on now. You know, obviously the England team are going to listen to our podcast, and we're going to give them some information here. So what is it strategy-wise that it takes, firstly, to score a penalty, and then let's look at a goalkeeper saving a penalty. Is there any things that, well, I suppose two things. What are they doing, and/or what should they be doing to score a penalty?
Well, the biggest thing they focused on over the last since Southgate came in really was around the pressure side of penalties. So a lot of work has been done to focus on that, bring expertise in to ensure that they actually have clarity and do certain basic things like not talk about it as a lottery, and just have more positive language around the shootout. And then strategies, it's a bit awkward really, because your goalkeeper independent, which is essentially pick a spot and hit it to that spot. The success rate for that's about 80% in the EPL. And if you're using keeper dependent, using the Jorginho type approach and trying to trigger a dive in the goalkeeper, success there is also about 80%. So overall, the success of the two is similar. It looks a lot worse when you fail to score if you use the keeper dependent one, because it tends to be an easy save. But yes, so I think it's more around actually just having clarity of the strategy that you want to use. Certain kickers like Ivan Toney are exceptionally good, and he has an interesting strategy that we could spend a while on. But others like Harry Kane, who tends to be more keeper independent and head down, kick hard to a spot, also highly successful. So
you do know you've gone and done it now, Robin, don't you? You've just called out Ivan Toney for being brilliant at penalties. I'm just putting it out there before.
Well, we have a number of. The start of having a good shootout is that you actually have a lot of regular penalty takers in your team, and I think England have got a fairly good crew of highly successful players. So that certainly is a start, because it tends to be more towards the the latter stages. If we go to sort of sudden death kicks or less frequent or regular penalty takers, then I think the challenge for them is quite a lot more.
I think it really transfers. If you look at like a rugby goal kicker and you go look at a penalty that they strike, and you can look at free kicks as well in the middle of that, I think it's that regular routine of actually going and striking that ball on a regular occurrence that probably we don't develop that across the spectrum of the pathway and into the senior national team. And then when you get into penalties, it becomes a little bit of I've got to go back to a specific way of doing it. So actually just the routine of striking the ball or walking up, having your routine and going is a constant thing that people need to practice on over a regular time, over a period of time. You'll see that they'll go and pick up a ball and kick a few goals, and I got my under sevens that go and do that. But like actually getting them, sitting down and actually having a routine that they hit a specific target every time is where you'll get that repetition. And penalties, you don't have repetition. So it's a little bit harder. So like, how do you like make that environment for your team to prepare to go and deliver? And you've got to add fatigue into that, like huge fatigue after a period of time. And you might have been 1-0 up and you've gone 1-0. So mentally you're drained. So there's lots of other stuff factor into it, in which why clarity of routine is really important in my eyes.
Yeah, totally agree on that, and also then that feeds into the way they prepare and practice for shootouts these days. So it might well be at the end of a training session when you're highly fatigued, and they might have people around watching you to try and create a bit of pressure in that moment as well. And certainly that's something that wasn't happening not too long ago. I'm not sure for certain teams these days it still might not be happening, but certainly any opportunity to practice your routine, because what you're looking to try and do as a taker is to feel in control of the situation. And routine is a great way of feeling in control, or more in control of that situation. And that feeds through to your thoughts, your behaviors, your emotions. So the more you can feel like you're in control and you're not dealing with the balls being thrown away by the goalkeeper or whatever it happens to be, you're looking to try and just sort of settle and be in control. And some of your day's work from, it's 15 years ago, some of that now, but is really interesting around the response times of England, particularly. Actually, we're not good in terms of responding to the referee's whistle in about 0.3 seconds. As that feeling of wanting to get it over with was translating into their actual kicking technique on the pitch. So taking a couple of seconds, taking a deep breath, readying yourself, not just immediately responding to the referee's whistle, is a really basic thing that a lot of players are now doing.
Well, I know Donald sent it me earlier. In the Euros, we've had 5 shootouts and only won 1. Switzerland have had 3 and only won 1. So we'll see how that goes. I did have a couple of quick questions, Robin. So you mentioned like preparing for pressure. I mean, I suppose having the regular penalty takers who've been under pressure before, but is it really possible to prepare for pressure, as in the pressure that they're really going to face in 80,000 people, millions watching it on TV? I know you can try, but do you not find out till you find out? Like, how has that pressure really affected that performance? Choking type stuff.
I think that there's 2 separate questions there. One is the sort of classic, can you recreate the pressure of an actual shootout? Answer, no. And then the second is, can you prepare to deal with the pressure? Answer, yes, to some degree. So even if you can just, there's various pressure training programs that have been started with, I think, preparation for 2012 Olympics, when they started introducing pressure training, trying to minimize the difference between practice and competition, essentially. So you try and start building in things that generate some of those things that create pressure in the actual competitive environment. So like I said earlier, if you're doing it at the end of training and you've got all your teammates around ready to laugh at you, that might seem trivial, but to some of these guys, that still might give them a bit of a buzz. And there's plenty of research papers out there that show that using our kind of standard manipulations of having some kind of evaluation, apprehension, or cameras on you, those sorts of things, even though it doesn't increase anxiety hugely, it does increase it. And that gives you then an opportunity to practice your coping strategies. It's not maybe the same level you experience in a shootout of a final, let's say, but you're feeling a bit anxious, and you have to then practice those techniques, which would be the same techniques you then try and use in the competitive environment. What happens when you do those sorts of training things is their anxiety responses in the actual environment are pretty similar. They haven't changed much. They haven't become less anxious, but their performance is retained at a much higher level. So that's what I think you can do. And I think everyone's, come around to that, certainly in different sports, and football's a good example. And so, yes, you can prepare for the pressure of a shootout. No, you can't recreate the exact pressure you'll experience in a shootout.
I've got one more question linked specifically to penalties. And again, this goes back to my undergrad days. And so back then, I'm pretty sure someone had done some analysis, and I graduated in like 2003, that penalties that were struck above the midline of the goal basically got scored, and keepers don't save them. Is that still the case? And if so, why are players not going for top corners?
So yes, it is still true, but it's more a kind of roughly a meter arc in the corners. So it's more towards the corner than just the top half of the goal. But I mean, there was some analysis done it was a couple of years ago that suggested that overall it was still a better strategy, because yes, there's a risk of missing the goal, but it's less than the risk of being saved for lower kicks. So I think you do see more kicks directed to the top third of the goal, but it's still, when you're feeling maybe a bit nervous or fatigued or whatever, it probably feels like an even higher risk strategy than if you're feeling perfectly fresh. So yes, is sure that I think
would that be the reason players are choosing not to do it? The pressure, the fatigue, and just like, actually this is a bit more risky.
Possibly, I don't know. I mean, it might be different for different players, but you know, if I know that various people have encouraged coaches to, you know, to try and encourage their players to really perfect that and go for higher up. I mean, Harry Kane probably won't be doing it anytime soon, given he missed the one in the previous tournament doing essentially that strategy. So who knows? But yeah, the data support that as a strategy. But yeah, perhaps those margins when you're fatigued, maybe slightly different. Not sure.
I think the when you're talking about locations, players have got to feel comfortable with what you're asking them to do. And I think the data does say that, you know, goalkeepers will not save shots above a certain height if they're put in the corners. That's just like Harry Maguire's in the 2020 final, which was played at Wembley. Tremendous penalty, and when you pull it off, it looks fantastic, and the goalkeeper cannot save that. But a small error in margin leads to a bigger miss that looks worse. So like Roberto Baggio and Harry Kane and others have had penalties, Danny Olmo, where they've gone high, and I think there's obviously naturally like a fear of that there's more chance of missing the target, trying to aim for that compared to trying to put it in the corners. But what you've got to ask someone to do is something they're comfortable with and they feel they can do under pressure. And that's where, you know, analysis and other things, it's a give and take of, you can have a plan and in theory you might think it's a good plan, but is someone comfortable and confident to actually go and put it in practice? You know, they've got to feel like they can deliver it. So, and that's where there's a bit of give and take. And I think you might not strike the ball quite as well if you go in the bottom corner, but if you send the goalkeeper the wrong way, you know, it's not going to look as bad, or there's more chance of them scoring, or they feel like there's more chance of them scoring. And that's the human and the data part where they've got to overlap and sort of find a happy medium to some extent.
I think goalkeepers are also incredibly agile these days, and they are covering those, lots of ground. I think they're more aware of those time constraints and when they need to initiate their dives. So perhaps that becomes an even better strategy moving forward. It's trying to sort of think ahead and where things are going, and certainly the saves made last night. Goalkeeper really timed his dives to perfection and was covering pretty much the entire part of that, quite entire width of the goal. So yes, it's a bit of a gamble in terms of, is the player going to go the other way? But if you know from your data that player X tends to be keeper independent, then you can afford to go that bit earlier with your dive and cover more ground. You wouldn't do the same thing against a keeper dependent strategy kicker like a Jorginho or Fernandez.
Really conscious of time, and I've got one more kind of question to finish with, but I hugely appreciate it. It's given us a depth of understanding around how performance analysis works and the technology that's involved nowadays, and the difference between you've got the kind of objective and subjective measures and where you can do things in game or maybe not, pre and post. There's so much going on with analysis, and then some in-depth stuff there around penalties. So I'm gonna put it to you guys. If you guys were taking a penalty, let's say one of these games goes to penalties, Donald, where are you putting your penalty?
First of all, against an international level goalkeeper, I'd probably walk across the goal and save it if I was in that situation. But for me, when I do take penalties, and I have done previously, I go for the top corners, and I'm goalkeeper independent. I just go with power and try and put it in a top corner. And I usually stick to the same one. When I've changed my mind, which is the sort of golden rule, that's when I've tried to put the goalkeeper down, I'm not skillful enough to do that or confident enough to do that. So I think I would be going for a top corner with power.
Is it top left or top right? Are you right-footed, Donald?
So I'm right-footed, so I would go to the goalkeeper's left to my right, and I would probably signpost it quite heavily, but just hope that my power would beat them.
They'll kind of Baggio bend it in the top corner, side foot,
I was a defender, so the technical part was not my strong set. So I think against high quality goalkeepers, they'd find it quite comfortable. But I would have a preset plan and go for power.
Nice. Austin, what about yourself?
I'm going to go power down the middle. It's so underrated. Everyone's going to take to get there. I'll go power down the middle and try and get a little bit of height on it.
Okay, nice. Robin?
Well, I studied deception, don't I? So I've got to go for a deceptive one. I would shape to the right. I'm a left-footed, so I'd shape to the right and kick to the left, assuming the goalkeeper didn't know my stats. And if the pesky performance analysis guys had been in there and knew that I did that every time, then I might have to go for a top bins.
I go the other way. I go as if I'm going to go to the right and then smash it quickly in the bottom left. That's mine. I've done fairly well with them. I have tried to smack one in the top corner before, Donald, and my teammates still think it's travelling to the moon at this moment in time. So I've stopped that one.
My claim to fame is I did put one in the top corner of my weak foot one time. I went
in the playground?
No, in a game.
Well, nice. Guys, really appreciate you coming on, and nice to hear where you'd put your penalties. Hopefully the England team will listen to all these strategies we've got here, but I doubt it. But yeah, really appreciate it. Hopefully our audience have gained a bigger understanding of performance analysis generally, but also they can think about some of these things when they're watching that next penalty shootout that I'm sure is coming soon. Thank you all for coming on.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.